Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I'll be your host for today's show. This is actually one of my favorite shows of the year because we get to talk about the highlights from PwC's 2019 Annual Corporate Director Survey. And joining me to have this discussion is Leah Malone, who's the director with PwC's Governance Insights Center and one of the people intimately involved in the survey. So welcome, Leah.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So again, I really like reviewing this. Our history with this goes way back, okay? Last year got a lot of publicity, particularly in one area, and that was the area of whether directors felt that there was somebody on their board, or more than just somebody, were the members of their board that should be replaced. And we were quite surprised at the number.
Yep.
And now it looks like that's going to be the same discussion for this year because the number has actually gone up.
It has, yes. We'd love to ask this question of directors. Do you think someone on your board should be replaced? Last year, as you alluded to, 45% of directors told us yes. At least one or more than one director on our board should be replaced. We were surprised by that number. We felt that that was a pretty high level of discontent in boardrooms. But this year, 49%, just under half of directors tell us one or more than one director should go. And when you take apart that number a little bit, what you see is 23% of directors say that it's not just one, it's two or more than two directors on their board who they feel should be replaced. And so I think it gets at this question of what's going wrong in boardrooms. Well, we ask about what are your criticisms of your fellow directors? And there's really no one thing that stands out. They tell us a variety of things. Some point to directors overstepping their boundaries of authority. Some say that their fellow directors are reluctant to challenge management. Some say that their fellow directors just lack the skills and expertise that the company needs. So there's a variety of things that they're looking at. And I think part of where we see that discontent coming from is the fact that investors are so keenly focused on board composition. They're forcing so many conversations with boards about, do you have the right board members in your room to deal with the issues that your company needs to be thinking about? They're talking about board diversity. They're asking companies to disclose the skills matrices in their proxy statement that really illustrate what are the qualifications and skills of each director. How do you map that out? What is each person bringing? I think all this conversation about board composition is forcing directors to be a bit introspective and forcing them to look around their own boards and say, you know, perhaps we could be doing a little bit better. Perhaps the directors that made sense for this board 5 years ago are not the same directors that make sense today.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think the awareness, otherwise the number couldn't jump in these years.
Right.
But there is tremendous amount of focus on do you have the right people in the room, which is like, and the survey results is like waving a red flag in front of investors, because if I'm sitting there as an investor and I see this number and I look at their board evaluation or assessment process, of which almost all companies perform that procedure, and then I have to assume that they are not having the tough discussions or can't pull the trigger when multiple members are identify a person that isn't bringing the right skill set.
Exactly. Assessments is a big topic that we talk about in the survey as well. And I think there is a bit of good news, bad news story on the assessment front. For the first part, we ask directors, does your board take action as a result of your assessment process? That figure has gone up hugely. Since 2016, when less than half of directors said their board did something with the results of their assessment process, now 72% of directors say their boards are taking action. The question is, what action are they taking? Most of them tell us that they're doing things like adding additional expertise to the board, they're diversifying their boards, they might be changing the composition of their committees. What fewer are doing are exactly the harder steps that you alluded to. Only 15% of directors tell us that their boards are not renominating directors who are underperforming, and only 15% say that their board leadership is actually counseling underperforming directors. So at the same time that you see boards taking the assessment process quite seriously, I think gone are the days when boards would every couple years do the assessment, write it down, stick it in a drawer and forget about it. Boards really are taking it more seriously. It's just difficult to get over the hump of taking those really difficult actions to force the refreshment on the board.
Well, we both know that board evaluations are just a super critical process that the board needs to follow, and that suggests that these boards that can't have this tough discussion, there's a board leadership issue.
Yeah.
Okay, and with the center all the time, I mean, we're always talking about board leadership, and it seems like all these topics sort of work their way back
Absolutely.
to that. So we can't stress enough the criticalness of that, and it's a great segue into this next topic, and I don't want to make too much of this, because I know when you asked the question, you asked it, do you find it difficult to talk about any of these things?
Mm-hmm.
But it's still disturbing, the numbers are still disturbing, that people feel that they can't be a dissenting voice in the boardroom. So talk a little bit about that question and then the answers, because this is another thing I'm not sure is going to be great news. By the way, do you have any great news coming out of this?
We always try to look for a little bit of great news to talk about. But on this question, it was a new question this year. We asked, is it difficult to voice a dissenting view on any of the following topics? And of course, we chose topics that are inherently difficult. So it was things like CEO compensation, renomination of directors, topics that you would expect are touchy in the boardroom. But we were surprised to see the percentage of directors who saying yes, they have a difficult time. 43% of directors said that it was tough to voice dissenting views in one or more of those areas. And when we dig down a little bit further into those numbers, what we did was we separated out directors who sit on boards with CEO chairs and directors who sit on boards with non-executive chairs or lead independent directors. And there the numbers really got kind of stark. So on directors who sit on boards with CEO chairs, 57% said that it was difficult to voice a dissenting view in one or more areas. You compare that to only 41% in the other group. So there is something, getting back to that leadership question, it's not only who is the board chair, but I think there's something to what type of a role does that person play within the boardroom and within the company writ large, and is that in some way inhibiting open discussion in the boardroom?
Could this be the first piece of research that gives, when people are looking for support on why should we split this position, and no one in the performance end could come up with any reasonable, data on that. Yet here is a culture, if you will, a board culture issue, okay, that from your research shows that may be silencing certain people on the board and their professional opinion.
Yes, perhaps, and I don't want to make too much of it, because there certainly are CEO chairs who are very effective leaders of their boards, but it is something to think about when you're considering your board leadership structure.
Yeah, well, here we are back at board leadership again.
Yep.
So let's jump to another topic, diversity. So I was a little confused, maybe, which isn't hard for me, but it was interesting to see that everybody understood that a diverse board was a better board and a more effective board. At the same time, I was surprised to see that a fairly good segment said, hey, we're tired of being beaten around the head. We understand diversity, but we've got it.
Yes, exactly. So let's unpack that a little bit. We asked directors, what is the benefit of board diversity in the boardroom? And over the years, we see an increasing percentage of directors, now nearly all of them, agree that board diversity enhances board performance, that it brings unique perspectives to the boardroom, that it improves relationship with investors. Even 3/4 agree that it enhances not only the board's performance, but the performance of the company. So that's a huge shift in even just the last couple of years of the number of directors who really understand that diversity makes the board a better place and makes it more effective. So on the one hand, you have those results. We also ask how many directors' boards are focusing on increasing their diversity within the boardroom. 3/4 of directors tell us, yes, our boards are working on this. But as you alluded to, we also ask about investor focus on different issues. And this year, almost 2/3 of directors told us that they think investors are too focused on the issue of board gender diversity. Now, of course, some of that is coming from the fact that they are hearing so much about it, that it is such a hot priority for investors. But when you compare that even just to last year, only 30% of directors told us that last year, that investors were too focused on it. A huge increase in just a year. But I think in a way, the broader picture is showing us that directors really do get it. They understand that diversity is important in their boardrooms. They want to achieve it. They're working on it. But as we know, and coming back to the issue of refreshment, it takes time for boards to change. And so even a boardroom that's completely committed to the idea of increasing their own diversity, they might have a 2-year, 5-year, 10-year plan to get there. Whereas investors are looking for results a little bit faster than that. And I think some of the irony here is that many of these changes that we are seeing in boardrooms, as more women are coming onto boards, more racial and ethnic minorities are coming onto boards, many of those changes would not have come about if not for the investor focus. But directors are now saying, okay, we get it, we're working on it, you can stop browbeating us about diversity.
Well, when you look at State Street and the New York City pension funds withholding votes on boards, when you see California passing that legislation, it's no surprise that now what is a little bit of a surprise is all this is gender based.
Yeah.
Now obviously we know that's one piece of diversity on the board and,
Right.
and diversity of thought. It's the most measurable piece, so I think it gets the most attention for that. In my mind, there's still a concern about people of color, particularly in the Hispanic community, which is our largest ethnic community, is not keeping pace, okay, with this. On the good news front, all of the Fortune 500 companies have a woman on the board, which is a advancement, because it wasn't that long ago that there was 80 companies, I think, to go. So it's happening. It is not happening fast enough for people, but the good news is no matter who I talk to today, they get it, and they're trying to make the prudent changes, and there are a lot of organizations that are trying to offer up candidates so that they can change.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, you had mentioned this, and I've always thought this was a category that is very tough to get your arms around, and that's culture. And we know, just as we've seen investors want purpose, okay, for the companies, and the Business Roundtable came out with it, all this sort of gets back to the culture of a company. And it's a challenge. Challenge to get your arms around, challenge to measure, whatever. So tell us a little bit. You didn't have a lot of questions on that, but you did have some questions around culture.
Yeah, and what I think was notable this year was when we asked directors, where do you see the problems of corporate culture coming from? What's not surprising is that most of them point to tone at the top and the tone set by middle management at the company. Those are obvious answers. What surprised us was the number of directors who'd said that lack of board oversight also contributed or could contribute to culture problems at a company. It's still not a huge number, but a huge increase from last year when only 18% of directors agreed with that statement. You look at 29% of directors saying the same this year. So really a recognition among many more directors of the idea that the boardroom matters when it comes to company culture. They're not pointing to themselves and saying the board is where the culture problems start, But what they are saying is that boards can have an impact on company culture. And it matters in terms of understanding what the company's culture is, understanding how to measure culture in different ways, understanding when it's starting to go wrong, and having a view into how they can affect what management is doing to impact that company culture.
So on the show, numerous times I have mentioned that while it's difficult to get your arms around, a board will have several watershed moments during the year that they can help define what a company's culture is. It may be how they respond to, somebody that's working outside the lines and FCPA or whatever. So to be aware of certain decisions and actions and how they impact what you've been professing you want your culture to be is something that's good. And I would agree the same effect that's had on diversity in some of the other areas and on directors being replaced, I think is true here too. The fact that culture is being brought up and brought up and brought up, the sensitivity on the director's part is much, much higher, and that's why I think the number takes a quantum leap. And that's probably a good thing, this awareness that, okay, I'm aware of that now.
Yeah, I think so.
So, first of all, this is the sort of premier research. It's always fun. You guys get a lot of people referring back to this. It's a lot of directors, so it's a valid survey. But if you had to summarize, if you had to sort of take all these responses and sort of summarize it into a theme that you might have about this research, what would your sort of theme be?
Yeah, I think my big takeaway from the survey this year was that we see many boards in what we call the collegiality conundrum. They're in this place where they want to be, and boards pride themselves on being collegial places where directors are respected, where they view each other as peers, they don't compete with one another, they don't openly criticize one another, they value consensus building. All of those are very positive things when we think about corporate boards. But I think there's a risk of boardrooms becoming a little bit too insular, focusing a little bit too much on all of the directors fitting in and getting along at the risk of board effectiveness. And some of the places where we saw that come out through the survey is directors, in fact, telling us that they would like to replace some of their peers secretly. The fact that directors do have difficulty voicing dissent in certain areas. The fact that many directors told us that collegiality on their board is inhibiting the board's ability to refresh. So there's this idea that they're becoming a little bit trapped as collegial places where they focus so much on consensus building and getting along that directors are not able to be open and honest, and that the board is not able to make the changes that they need to make in order to be very effective.
Well, Leah, I love when this research comes out. We have not had the chance to talk about a big issue, which is ESG. I'm going to have you back for that because that's going to be, there's some great data.
There's more to talk about.
Yeah, there's great data on that as well. I want to thank you for taking the time on coming in and giving us the highlights and lay of the land. And again, we'll look forward to having you back to cover that missing topic.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.